Today's episode of Tilly's Corner has been made possible by the following contributors: Erica Medeja, Monica Wong, Alberto Semino, and Andrew Obando. Today's topic: euthanasia and the legalization in all 50 states. Euthanasia should not be legalized in all 50 states on the grounds of morality. There's no adequate reasoning to push laws that will legalize euthanasia only to further socially accepted norms. Many times people will make the argument of we do what makes the patient comfortable, but that only rebrands it as a socially acceptable. Redefining the definition of death will justify other acts such as murder. Physicians can't label suicide on the death certificate because it hasn't even been accepted. So to change in favor of euthanasia is to challenge the physician's stance of patient care and could potentially break this idea of physician trust. Jane Addams introduces the idea of the non-profit in response to the for-profit. So her fear is in the for-profit that humans will potentially ignore basic human rights in order to take advantage of the system, all in the name of a profit. An example would be corrupt physicians who will sometimes push things like eye surgery or any other forms of medical procedures, not because the patient needs them, but because it would benefit the physician themselves. They also have the waivers, which prevent physicians from getting sued for malpractice. The legalization of euthanasia would violate the rights of the feeble-minded, the weak, and the unconscious. Keep in mind of two possible outcomes in regards to the weak and the feeble-minded. The legalization would either empower the patients who are not mentally stable, which means the physician would have no choice but to take into account their decision in whether they want to die or not. Or there's the other option where, because of the fact that they are unable to make decisions on their own, the physicians would have control over whether they get to live or not, and that would just give them too much power. And the same would go with the unconscious. Because they're not aware of what's happening, it leaves their lives in the hands of the physicians. By legalizing euthanasia in all 50 states, you also legalize other pains that would assist euthanasia. Any emotional pains such as depression or anger, anxiety, or even any mental states, PTSD. These, in essence, are factors that can drive into suicide, but yet we don't condone suicide within our own society. To legalize euthanasia is to legalize suicide and justifying this act of taking one's life.
In opposition of my peer, I believe euthanasia should be legalized in the United States. Euthanasia gives patients the right to end their own life on their own terms. If they decide to do so, this allows for the patients to know that their life was long-lived and surrounded by their loved ones. My peer believes it is immoral to end one's life, but each individual has their own morals and values. In doing so, it is right to say that individuals should have the right to choose. If the patients believe that euthanasia is in their best interest, their decision should be respected. Therefore, I believe it becomes a controversy for individuals to be against euthanasia. Individuals who are against may presume that they are helping patients by voting against euthanasia, but in reality, it is hurting the patients even more. Patients have to continue to fight for their lives and fight for the legalization of euthanasia. Stories are told every day by patients that they want the pain and suffering to end. So how is it fair to promote how immoral euthanasia can be when it is immoral for individuals to believe that it is selfish for patients to end their life? Furthermore, in terms of Jane Addams, she emphasizes sympathy. Therefore, it is important to understand from their perspective that they can no longer live with the pain and suffering. As the saying goes, it is in the eye of the beholder. Thus, their life should be in their own hands. Euthanasia is a very sensitive subject for many. However, it is already being practiced across the United States. Every time someone is put to death by lethal means administered by another person, it can be considered an act of euthanasia. The perpetrator or criminal in question has committed a serious crime, which many people, usually a judge or a jury, then consider the human unfit to live in our society. The outcome is either life in prison or death in order to make our world a better place. We take fate into our own hands and justify it with a set of regulations. Although a crime is not committed when assisted suicide is practiced, the logic is in the same realm. In fact, it is more justifiable than murdering a criminal A human being who's alien and wishes to die on their own terms should also be given the same powers with their own life as we give to others. Some of the benefits are the patients die knowing that this was their choice. The patients can die with dignity rather than a shell of their former selves. Healthcare costs can be reduced, thus the nurse or doctor can move on to another patient that has a chance at living instead of spending their time helping a terminally ill patient. Organs could be saved and used to aid other people. Families could save themselves from having to endure a long, difficult bout, financially and emotionally. It also gives everyone involved time to prepare accordingly. Regardless of prior arrangements made by the person who is on life support, they usually do not possess the proper cognitive skills to make such a decision at the time, so essentially that person cannot change their mind. They're usually incapacitated and in severe pain. Thus in turn transfers the decision to someone who they themselves may not be competent enough to responsibly make that decision, but then acts on impulse. When one is tasked with the responsibility of deciding if their loved one should live or die, they themselves are in despair and usually act on self-interest. The issue I would like to raise is if we transfer such a decision to another person with our own life, then why can't we decide what happens to us while we still have a clear head, given certain criteria of course, to end our own life on our own terms? Jane Addams mentions that adjusting our moral conceptions which have passed through a course of development over time have become habits. We suffer from our failure in adjusting our moral conceptions, which causes more strain. If a person wants to look ahead and plan the inevitable to ease the strain on family and society, then euthanasia should be a possible option.
Against the legalization of euthanasia, another debate to consider is the concept of value of a life. Opponents claim that we should have the right to end our own life and have compassion for those who are suffering, but agreeing to that only reinforces their vulnerability and further reinforces murder and suicide as stated earlier. Under Jane Addams' ideology, she introduces the charitable worker and how they assist the less fortunate. But how are the less fortunate seen in the first place? They are seen as inferior, as of lacking qualities, and are stereotyped. Vulnerabilities create inequalities, and in this case, legalizing euthanasia in the active sense only reinforces their weaknesses and adds additional emotional burdens to the ones they are presently facing. Active euthanasia is no different than allowing a suicidal person to kill themselves. They're out of their rational mind and they are at their most vulnerable state. As for passive euthanasia, the emphasis on this argument is more on allowing someone to have control over another's life rather than their own. Now, if they are defined as brain dead, euthanasia may seem like the sensible choice for a person in a persistent vegetative state. However, euthanasia should not even be an option because it is simply not the duty of the doctors to commit and permit such an act. Euthanasia is no more different than eugenics. Doctors are supposed to assist in living, not in dying. It is simply not the duty to perform euthanasia. No one has the right to die. Jane Addams believes in preserving humanity. Our decisions are a reflection of not only ourselves, but of the society we live in. Therefore, if we were to understand the well-being and experiences of others in a way that promotes social ethics and democracy, we should do so by promoting the value of life rather than emphasizing death. In conclusion, we've talked about the following points: our stance against the legalization of euthanasia, as well as addressing possible counter-arguments. We've also talked about sociologist Jane Addams and her potential view on modern-day euthanasia. This has been another episode of Tilly's Corner, and we are signing off.